In the quest for assurance that both deminded and at least a rudimentary demindology still flourish, it was felt desirable and even imperative to set forth from the sheltered halls of learning and actually go to where the deminded are found. Hence our first procedure was to approach the various foundations for assistance in procuring the necessary tools of research, such as transportation money and funds for food and lodging. It is perhaps not too surprising that our very modest requests were turned down. Far from being disheartened, we interpret this funding as confirmation that we were on the right track, that we were indeed building a program far in advance of its time and were but seeing the traditional institution rejection of the new and significant. The opening of an exhibition of the Impressionist, Claude Monet, the paintings, and the occurrence of the annual celebrations of both men and pioneers strengthened our faith. At this point, we had a lucky stroke. By one of those breakthroughs upon the advance of learning has advanced deepened. The grandfather of one of our keenest graduate students set upon his own foundation, since we were able to finish him with documentary evidence that none of the big foundations was remotely interested in our field. Why, he gave us a grant at once. The first effect of adequate financing upon the project was a complete overhaul of our techniques. On the basis of years of studies, we had prepared our comprehensive demindological questionnaire. We had planned to administer to representative sampling of the population, securing that our cooperation through the presentation of small gifts, specialty ballpoint pens for the men, and pot holders for the ladies. With the grant, we were able to adopt more modern methods, with some personal regret, but with rigid adherence to the best professional standards. We scraped the questionnaires and brought a study of tape recorders in various size, equipped with microphones to the highest sensitivity. Our team of graduate students, after a cram course of electronics, pick up their tape recorders and their per diem allowances and dispersed over the length and breadth of the United States. Wherever possible, they gathered their material without the knowledge of the subject, thus avoiding the sample syndrome. And that affects many people when they know they are a part of a sociological dip into the mass consciousness. What follows is a section of the findings. It is presented raw, with no attempt to edit for unity, coherence, or emphasis, or indeed for anything at all except in the case of some of the more colorful profanity. This has been removed in order to allow the book to be sold by mail order, but it has been preserved in our vaults and will be made available on request to any of the bona fide scholars in this or related fields. For the benefit of the other scholars, similarly, trapped by the technological transition, I pass along the information that we are able, at a very slight loss, to dispose of the pens to used car dealers and the pot holders to the aspirants for the U.S. Congress. I am happy to report that we made a small profit in the questionnaires. With almost no change, they were found to be perfectly suited for motivational research by leading makers of motor cars. The subject of the superintendent of the schools in the community of Greensward, a prosperous suburb some miles outside a well-known metropolitan area. The place was a local elementary school, and the occasion an early fall meeting of the PTA. Our graduate student had no difficulty gaining admittance as a young mother. Due to the high sensitivity of the concealed microphone, the tape contains a running commentary from certain male members of the audience. This has been eliminated from the transcripts. The concept of demindism, of course, is an atavistic relic from the Dark Ages, when education was in the hands of the ill-prepared schoolmarms in the Middle West and of fanatical, classic, haunted marionettes of the East, that is to say, New England, and for those benighted days before John Dewey, people hadn't been taught to seek the cause and effect of things, and so rather haphazardly went about ascribing events and natural phenomena to the deminded instead, and to the actual cause of those causes in which the actual cause was ascertainable. And actually, that proportion of case was probably much higher than we think today in looking back in those ages, because a good deal of already ascertained and ascertained scientific knowledge had indeed been ascertained. The notion that the earth revolves around the sun rather than the vice versa being a reasonably well-known example, but since the ascertainable knowledge was within from the general two-way communication, not so much from the actively hostility to ascertain scientific knowledge on the part of the educator of those days, who, by the way, are almost always referred to as teachers in the surviving contemporary literature of the field as from deeply held fetishistic beliefs in the part of those educators or teachers that their primary function in the teaching learning situation was to impart to their students what was smugly known as the rules and grammar and syntax, and do drills. Yes, actually to drill. And all the deadly inhuman repetition that term implies, to drill those students into what was regarded as the arts, no less how to write an English sentence and how to make it stop. We have changed all that. It is therefore singularly appropriate that the principal deminded, menacing American education today are avatars, evolutionary sports, throwbacks to the Middle Ages, survivals of the past, and reactionaries in general. I should like to make the point, parenthetically, that when I use the word reactionaries, I do in so not political sense whatsoever, and I make this point parenthetically, because when I did use the word, I noticed a few of your fathers stir briefly into hostility feelings, or in an educator has long experience, in seeing what goes on behind the silent faces in front of him. So I assure you that to such is not the case. So much so it is not indeed the case that let me confide in you that while in principle I believe that every man has a right to his own political convictions, at whatever shade they may be, this principle of mine conflicts with another, even more deeply held principle that, to be effective at all, an educator must sympathize or feel with the community of which he minds or finds himself as a part, whose children he hopes to lead out in which he finds a part of whose children he hopes to lead out, to use the literal meaning of the verb to educate from, I believe, the Latin, and therefore I feel no hesitation in telling you that although when I was at the Educational Institute, I cast my first ballot for the progressive ticket of Mr. Wallace, that being the climate of opinion at the Institute at the time. Since receiving the call to Greensward, I have unhesitatingly joined with my new neighbors in going out down the line for Ike and Dick and more. And recently the Dick and Cabot. Yep. By the way, I know that some of your fathers and mothers are actively political. I certainly received telephone calls from many of you during the last year's festivities. And if you know that ever is going to happen to that Henry or in Henry Cabot Lodge, I'd appreciate hearing about it after the meeting. I might as well tell you I have 2 reasons for that, of which it is detached scholarly interests in the change that occurred to the words, and the other in which is my belief that the particular change had something to do with the regrettable results of that particular election. In the first place, I think that was when we dropped Henry and he began speaking only of Cabot. It confused people. They weren't sure if it was the same man. And in the second place, I think it gave people a good feeling, a completely without foundation in the objective fact, I hasten to add, that we had something to hide. I trust that these unavoidable personal revelations had served the worthy purpose of building rapport between the parents of Greensward and their chief educator administrator of department. It is a part and point strongly insisted upon by all modern pedagogical theories of parents and educators and goggles. We have got to work together or they'll be working separately. Have you to watch these children every second? Do I make myself clear? Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me in the back? The task before us, and by us I mean educators, legislators, and parents, and just plain citizens, the task we face is to clear away the last remnants of the past that still survive like avatars in our educational system. It's no good blinding ourselves to the fact that those avatars are still around. The work of clearing the ground has begun. It begun years ago, and I'm proud to have played the local level of my own small part in the work. You recall that when I came to Greensward, the building we are in tonight was known as the Grammar School, which, and split words, anachronism. What an avatar, one would say. Well, I am happy to remind you that we now call it, with simple dignity, the Elementary Consolidated School. Modest, accurate, and with no distressing overtones of fetish worship. We have taken another step towards and forwards with the beginning of this present academic year, and this step into the reason I have decided to address myself tonight, because I know from the reports I get from my associate educators in the classrooms that we are based on the reports, and they get that from the children themselves, and that from some of you you have failed them. So to understand our latest innovation, some of you are even seem to be hurt by it. So to take it as personal things, and well, therefore I wish to assure you that such things is not the case at all. At this time, I should like to remind you that an innovation made some years ago, and one that has proved to be extremely popular by the children mothers in the neighborhood. That old innovation was the special field trip for the second grade students, on which they were given the experience of mailing a letter. Now, I don't mind telling you that when we put out the innovation for the invitation in the first place, we met with a certain amount of opposition. One parent, who has since moved to another community, is actually on record in the fact of the minutes of the preparatory meetings with the parents for the field trip, as of saying the innovation was, and I quote from the record, a lot of goddamn nonsense. End of quote. In all fairness, what kind of two-way communication between the school and community can we expect if parents are going to take all those kind of attitudes? But, and in spite of those discouraging comments, we went ahead with the field trip, proved a great success. Parents were notified in advance, and every year's field trip saw an increasing number of young mothers on the hand to record on film and in motion pictures and experience little Johnny or Susie, as the case may be, dropping his and her letters into the mailbox in the corner. Last year, as many as you may recall, Mr. and Mrs. Rappaport, whose son Raoul was discussing to the chairman of the second grade, recorded the whole experience in color motion with the sound and ladder. We were very much enjoyable. It was a great meeting, watching her films. Yep. At my mediation, it became part of the permanence, the audiovisual archives of the Educational Institute. It is very good that she did, because her full deliberation, our innovation this year has been to eliminate those experimental field trips to the mailbox. This step has not been taken lightly, and I feel you are entitled to a full explanation of the reasonings behind it. There will be time for discussion later. In making this discussion, namely, to eliminate from the second grade curriculum the traditional experimental field trip to the mailbox, we have been moved chiefly by the consideration that after we have believed for years that reading and writing are avatars of the past, and we must be swept aside if any kind of deminding is to have any equality, it is to be achieved in our schools. By reading and writing, you are aware, are carried by in and on by individuals as individuals. Frankly, we are only deceive ourselves when we have students or educators read aloud and try to pretend that reading has thusly been made into a group activity. Therefore, with the courage of our own convictions, we ask ourselves, in a group-oriented experimental educational system, what place is there for an activist this-ish of letter writing? The answer is clear, and if there's no place for the writing letters, there should certainly be no place for mailing letters. We should not deny to the children that we're letter writing to still practice, and if they ask questions about the mailbox, we should explain that they are simply, without harassment, in words they can understand, but we should certainly not go out of our way to call this survival of an earlier cultural complex to their attention. In closing, I should like to say a word about the highly organized campaign that has been going on recently, and that consists in running down your schools, pretending that some people can do English better than English or any other kind of private school, of parochial school, or anyone except the poor, overburdened educators and administrators whose lives are quite dedicated, and I may say, widely unappreciated. Specific changes have been made in this deliberate, confidence-shaking, whispering campaign will be answered in the details in the assuming programs of our group in the course of the academic year, but right now I should like to report one more interesting item for information. The source of the charges have been classified, distributed, weighted, processed, and analyzed by the giant punch card computer of the Educational Institute, and a median has been established, as well as a progressive percentile and probability curve. All these analytical tools point to just one thing. First, many of the critics of the system send their own children to private schools, and hence have no first-hand experience or experiential knowledge of the subject they discuss so freely. And secondly, every one of the more prominent so-called critics without exception, gains all of the considerable part of his income in one way or another by writing, and furthermore, is so situated in the size of his economy to directly depend upon the number of people at any given time who know how to read. In other words, with small interest, it has been established. It's one thing to come up with the grips with an honest avatar or anachronism. It's quite another to engage in open debate with people who are merely fighting for their own selfish ends. Is there any questions?